Whether or not I have a right to defend myself outside of my home is not even a question. Welcome to another installment of the Connecticut Gun Bench. Today's video is brought to you by P.A.N. Firearms, LLC. P.A.N. Firearms are your NRA certification and multifaceted gun training. You can reach us at 203-300-6343 or use our website at www.panfirearmsllc.com. As always, there'll be a link in the description box below. Now let's talk about this here. As we know, the Supreme Court is hearing a gun rights case brought by the New York Pistol Club, and actually on behalf of two of their members, against the state of New York. Basically what they're arguing is that New York's carry permit restrictions are too strict. Now we're coming to the end of this because the Supreme Court they've had the hearing, and the Supreme Court, is going on, and we're pretty close to a decision. I stayed out of this for a little bit just to get a better grasp, because I could report on this every day and every single thing that's said and done. But for a quick recap, I'm going to play this video here, ABC13 from Houston, Texas, obviously, speaking on this. Obviously, it's coming from the point of view of Texas, where, constitutional carry is the law.
Cases between a group of gun owners in New York and the state of New York. They're challenging a law that severely limits the right to carry a gun outside of someone's home, something in Texas we already have the right to do even without a permit. The justices heard arguments for and against New York's restrictive gun law, which requires applicants for permits to show proper cause for carrying a firearm. Those challenging the long-standing law are two gun owners and the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association. Their attorney, Paul Clement, argued New York's law does not work with the Constitution.
You simply can't carry them for self-defense anywhere frequented by the public because you haven't demonstrated an atypical need. I mean, that's about as untailored a law as I can imagine.
The state defended its law and argued gun rights are not unlimited and that reasonable restrictions are what's best for the public.
New York is not an outlier in the extent to which the state restricts the ability to carry firearms in public, and it's not an outlier in asking a license applicant to show good cause for a carry license.
Outside the chambers on the steps, another day of demonstrations in a week that saw cases from Texas involving abortion rights and free speech. Among those siding with New York State today were former Congresswoman and gun violence survivor Gabby Giffords.
We are at a crossroads. We can let the shooting continue, or we can act. We can protect our families or our future.
If the court rules against New York's law and finds it too restrictive, it could open the door for more gun owner-friendly rules in other states too, directly impacting some 80 million Americans. Either way, it will be the first significant ruling on the Second Amendment in more than a decade.
Now, I'm going to just real briefly go over the case here. October 31st, the New York Post reported on the Supreme Court starting to hear arguments. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I'm just going to touch on it because there's always the same arguments in here. I'll come right down to this New York Post article where Supreme Court to hear case on New York gun permit law. This is October 31st, 2021. Now I go down to this section here. Gun control groups say if a high court ruling requires states to drop restrictions, the results will be more violence. And that is what they always say when there's a ruling that just doesn't go in their favor. That somehow loosening restrictions brings more violence. That's just pretty much their bread and butter argument. They don't produce any proof, they just say it. Gun rights groups, meanwhile, say the risk of a confrontation is precisely why they have a right to be armed for self-defense. Don't need to really jump into all this because this is just setting the groundwork for what is happening now, because we're coming close to the decision. And as you heard from the video, the Supreme Court, due to what they consider a conservative majority, might rule in favor of the plaintiffs, which is the New York State Pistol Rifle Association. But what I really want to talk about is this opinion article that came out again in the New York Post, and it just says Post editorial board. So it doesn't really say who wrote this, but I read this and quite honestly, I had to speak on it. So New York Post, pray the Supreme Court doesn't leave New York defenseless to control flood of weapons on streets. Right away, the headline is, how does the Supreme Court saying that people who follow the law is somehow going to impede New York from combating illegal gun trafficking? But once again, I don't think this person is going to explain this, but let's go ahead. When the Supreme Court rules on New York's gun laws, presumably within the next couple of months, I pray it doesn't leave the state defenseless to control a flood of weapons on the streets. The court is set to rule on a challenge to the laws by two upstate New Yorkers, Robert Nash and Brandon Koch, who were denied unrestricted licenses to carry firearms after they failed to show proper cause. That's a requirement in New York. You must provide some cause why you need this permit. And if your cause is not good enough for them, you're not getting it. It's especially in the 5 boroughs. I'm not from New York, but I know that in the 5 boroughs, it's basically impossible unless you got great connections and some serious cash to throw around. You can get an unrestricted carry permit in the city, in the 5 boroughs. Outside of New York, it's kind of iffy. Now, people from New York, give me a heads up on what goes on there. I'd appreciate that. i.e., special need for self-protection as the law requires. They and other gun rights advocates argue that such a requirement places an unconstitutionally high burden on legal gun owners. Of course it does. You don't have to say when you are looking for a permit to speak on a street corner or whatever that you know your speech is particularly important, noted Chief Justice John Roberts during oral argument. So why do you have to show, in this case, convince somebody that you're entitled to exercise your Second Amendment right? Yet Roberts and his fellow justices surely know that no amendment is a blank check. Reasonable restrictions can be perfectly constitutional, especially if the public faces grave dangers without them. Okay, if you are out on the streets and for the most part, the criminal knows that by law, if you're a law-abiding citizen, you're not going to have a firearm, that puts you in graver danger than you as a law-abiding citizen obtaining a permit to carry that gun on the streets to the public. It's kind of a twisted argument. The Constitution, it's often said, is not a suicide pact. But that makes no sense. Once again, it's a bad argument. And make no mistake, New York, which is the midst of an alarming surge in gun crimes. Well, New York, if you actually didn't have bail-free releases and letting criminals go back out in the streets who committed violent crimes, on top of the fact that you're not prosecuting heavily, don't you think that leads to a surge in crime in general? So I don't see how gun control laws are somehow, or the lessening of, or unhindering of gun control laws is going to somehow equates to gun crime. Gun crime happens anyway. Chicago, do I have to point that out? Detroit. I mean, you don't have to point out all the obvious examples of how gun control just doesn't work. But another video needs at least some restrictions on who gets to own and carry guns. There already are restrictions on who can own and carry guns. We have New York especially. They have plenty of law to prevent someone from owning a firearm. Bad argument. Last year, 488 people were murdered in the city alone, many killed by a gun, even with the restrictive laws that New York has. Think about that. That's a whopping 65% spike over 2018, when just 295 were slain. Over the year, 1,857 people were hit by gunfire, and the number of shooting victims this year through April 24th, 441 is already up 8.6% over the same period last year. Okay, now, if this person who wrote this had any honesty, they would ask a simple question. Well, who is doing this? Is it the person who has a carry permit who went through absolute hell with the state to get? Are they the ones doing this? So once again, how does allowing the average person who has proven themselves to be lawful and competent getting a permit is going to prevent this and these numbers from spiking? Once again, it's a bad argument. The last thing New York needs is for every Tom, Dick, and Harriet on the street to be carrying. Right. Not every Tom, Dick, and Harriet should be on the street carrying. Though the Tom, Dick, and Harriets we should be talking about are the people who play by the rules, the people who don't have criminal records, the people who don't go out errantly shooting people for whether it be property or some kind of bragging rights. Moreover, the argument for reasonable restrictions on the Second Amendment is hardly new. They always use these like catchphrases, reasonable restrictions. And then you have to ask them, well, what do you consider reasonable restriction? And they can't tell you. They don't want to tell you. Let me be clear about that. They don't want to tell you. But if they could get away with an all-out ban on firearms in public hands, oh, they'd go for it. Sure, it wouldn't even bat an eyebrow doing it. Indeed, many conservative legal experts support New York's law, noting that government regulations on guns go back centuries, and that the founders meant for that tradition to continue when they drafted the Second Amendment. That's why it says, shall not be infringed. Strange way for they wanted restrictions, but they come out with that language. That wording appears nowhere else in that document except for the Second Amendment. Shall not be infringed. But according to this person, they wanted regulations on guns right from the beginning. I don't know about that. I think that's a bad argument because true history shows us that the first gun control laws were based in racism. And that's a fact. But never did they intend to provide every American with an unchecked right to carry firearms whenever and wherever they liked, even though they did. Back when this was written, this was, if you own a firearm, you could carry it where you wanted. For the most part, you could carry it where you wanted. You didn't need a license for it. If you could afford it, you bought it and you carried it. But the Supremes must let New York protect itself, whether by simply upholding New York's law or, if they find it unconstitutionally broad, as seemed likely based on their questioning during the case, ordering modest tweaks. One possibility, grant the state the right to limit public spaces where guns are allowed. Well, that's kind of stupid because if you're going somewhere that has this restriction on carrying, then what's the point of taking it out of your home? Because once you get to that place, you're going to have to do something with that firearm. You can't leave it in your car. But forcing New York to let anyone at all carry a firearm anywhere they want, no questions asked, is a recipe for disaster. And this guy's or whoever wrote this, is just taking a big broad stroke. No, people shouldn't be allowed to carry guns. Everyone can't carry a gun. It's nonsense. Okay? Nonsense. Not everyone can carry a firearm. Of course, there's room there for common sense, but when good people come to you and say, I would like to apply for a permit, they can show that they are a good person, no record, no problems, no history of anything, they shouldn't have to provide you reasons why they need it. And like I said, whoever wrote this, very one-sided, New York Post. As always, I'll leave this in the comment sections. You can read it yourself. There are a lot of links going back to the original Supreme Court case. But this is interesting, to say the least. Like I said, I saw this and I had to comment on it because this person is just painting this whole thing with a broad brush that all of a sudden the Supreme Court's going to say, yes, the laws are more, too restrictive and you can't ask for cause. And that somehow is going to open a floodgate for every Tom, Dick, and Harriet to go out and get a permit. No, they got to go through a process. They got to be background checked. And it's not going to stop. But ultimately, even if the Supreme Court rules in the plaintiff's favor, it's not going to stop the criminal element for doing what they're doing. All the gun crime they're having in their city and in their state is due to the criminal element. Remember, this is the same state that went for bail-free releases, were letting out criminals because of COVID, which made no sense whatsoever. But now they're whining about gun crime without acknowledging the fact that their own actions are the reason why criminals are becoming more emboldened. But we're going to watch this and see what the Supreme Court comes up with. It's going to be very interesting because that's going to hopefully open the door for other states that have restrictive mantras on getting a concealed carry permit or a carry permit in general. As we know, as of right now, I mean, 25 states are constitutional carry, which means you don't need a permit to carry a gun. And Ron DeSantis down there in Florida has already expressed interest in doing it himself, which means that half the country, more than half the country is going to be a constitutional carry states. So I think that's pretty much another issue that they're afraid of. But I am no problem with reasonable restrictions. I honestly, personally, don't have a problem with taking a course. I don't have a problem with applying for a permit. I don't. I really don't. As long as this is not used in an abusive manner, I have no problem with it. But I do have a problem with you telling me how I can exercise that right after I've jumped through every hoop and hole that you wanted me to jump through to get that permit. How many rounds I can carry in a magazine at any given time. How does telling me what I can and cannot do going to prevent crime? They won't answer that. But let me know what you think. As always, you can leave your comments in the comment section below. And as always, any calls for violence or statements that lead to violence will be removed. Please like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you get notified the next time a video goes live. And I will see you on the next one. Peace.